They're the people you thought you knew, the lives you want to know more about. 24 hours a day. This is the place for the lives of our times. You're watching the Biography channel. He was an extraordinary man, living in extraordinary times. A legendary artist, his mind exploded with modern ideas, and he created the world's most celebrated painting. Renaissance man Leonardo da Vinci, beginning now on Leaders and Legends.
Leonardo da Vinci, a painter.
Well, he was a genius.
Who is this?
I am Leonardo da Vinci, naturally.
What did he do?
Cut off his ear.
He didn't have an ear. Was that him?
Isn't he running for mayor?
He painted the Sistine Chapel.
No, that's Michelangelo.
Michelangelo, that charlatan.
What did he do?
Painted the Mona Lisa.
Most likely it was the Mona Lisa, because the way the picture seemed like it was like looking at people when they walk by and stuff like that.
You don't tamper with that great work of art. What have these barbarians done to my Mona Lisa?
Leonardo da Vinci. Didn't he have a restaurant once?
Last Supper, which is very famous.
Who?
Who's Leonardo da Vinci?
Well, he was futuristic.
Studied anatomy.
Mathematician, philosopher, inventor.
And the original Renaissance man.
I don't know anything about Leonardo da Vinci, really.
Maybe you can enlighten me.
Leonardo da Vinci is the beloved grandfather figure of the Renaissance. No one's paintings are more familiar, and no one is held in higher esteem in all of art history. Leonardo changed the world of art completely and forever. His fascination with science, and particularly his study of anatomy, enabled him to paint hauntingly realistic pictures that almost seemed to come to life. It is from this small town in the countryside near Florence that Leonardo takes his name, Vinci. Leonardo was born in 1454. His father was a respected notary named Ser Piero. His mother was a local peasant girl named Caterina. Probably because of his mother's humble status, she and Ser Piero never married, and Leonardo was raised by his father. The boy's illegitimacy would prevent him from joining his father's profession. Indeed, had he been born into a respectable marriage, Leonardo da Vinci might never have picked up a paintbrush.
Given the fact that he was illegitimate, he could not become a notary. Therefore, they had to search out some other activity for this young boy. And obviously, I mean, you can be certain that he was very gifted. I mean, he could draw, he could do things. Probably he was ambidextrous. And so when they saw that he was interested in art, they were able then to encourage that activity since he had no real other alternative.
Leonardo never got the schooling of a child born to wedded parents. Instead, he spent hours studying flowers, trees, and animals. All his life, Leonardo would say nature was the wisest teacher a man could have.
It is nobler to imitate things in nature, which are in fact the real images, than to imitate in words the words and deeds of man.
Leonardo's relationship with the nature surrounding Vinci is important because it lent much to the evolution of his thought and thus to his work.
The graceful, smoky scenery behind his Tuscan home stayed with Leonardo all his life and appears in many of his greatest masterpieces. Leonardo worshipped nature for its simple beauty and elegant engineering. He dreamed of learning its secrets, and his fondest dream was that man might one day fly like a bird. He also feared nature, having seen its frightening power of destruction.
When Leonardo was a child, there were two terrible floods in Florence. One of them was really a big, major catastrophe. We don't know what he saw that day, but probably something really horrible, and he had kind of nightmare for all his life.
Whatever his bad dreams, Leonardo realized a happy one when at 15, in about 1467, he went to the magical city of Florence to be an apprentice in an artist's workshop.
When Leonardo moved to Florence, Florence was really, in a way, the center of the world for arts, for literature, for science. All the greatest minds of the time were here.
We can only imagine the boy's excitement at his new job with Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's most important artists. Soon, Leonardo found himself mixing with elite society, including Verrocchio's patrons, the Medicis, Florence's ruling family. Verrocchio's shop was like a little university of the arts, and Leonardo thrilled in the variety of skills he was learning. Not only painting and casting bronze, but making furniture and even banners for processions. As a testament to his good looks and charm, the young Leonardo is said to have modeled for Verrocchio's statue of David, the slayer of Goliath.
One of the most interesting things he did, or certainly he observed, was the placement of the gold ball on top of the Florentine cathedral, 16 feet in diameter. And this was a major technological challenge.
Leonardo would soon come to lust after engineering challenges like this, but he also began to make his name as a painter. In 1472, the 20-year-old became officially registered in Florence's Guild of Painters and soon began to get his own commissions. His father arranged a job for him decorating a shield. Leonardo decided on a dragon. Well, the shield is long lost, but the story goes that Leonardo dissected lizards, insects, and bats and combined their features to make a horrifying beast. It worked. When his father saw the shield, he recoiled in fright. Leonardo proudly proclaimed, "That is what a shield ought to do." In about 1473, Verrocchio gave Leonardo the task of painting an angel in his Baptism of Christ. In this painting, Leonardo's early mastery stunned everyone, including Verrocchio. Taking his own skill in stride, Leonardo would later write, "He is a poor pupil who does not surpass his master."
For the first time in the history of painting, Leonardo represented a figure twisted toward the spectator. This was a kind of revolution in art history, because until this moment, every figure, every person was represented frontally in a very static and very archaic medieval manner. And so this introduced the movement in the figures.
That Leonardo comes along, paints the angel's head in the Baptism of Christ, and Verrocchio says, "Oh God, I've been vanquished. Here's somebody paint better than I can."
Verrocchio was so embarrassed at being outstripped by his pupil that from this moment on, he never painted again. Five years before, Ser Piero's bastard child had arrived in Florence with little more than a country boy's education. Now, he was a fashionable young painter and beginning to rub elbows with nobility. At the height of the Renaissance, in the capital of the art world, Leonardo was becoming a luminary. But Florence was, after all, a small city, and Leonardo knew his talent belonged in a much bigger one. His misery would soon be more than he could bear.
The life of Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci will continue in a moment, here on the Biography channel.
If you lived before our time, who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
You are watching the Renaissance master, Leonardo da Vinci, part of Leaders and Legends, here on the Biography Channel.
The Florence of the 1470s was teeming with brilliant thinkers, astronomers, geographers, philosophers, and musicians, and in all history there was no better time to be a painter. Young Leonardo da Vinci's profession put him in the midst of the most elite circles, but he was only one of Florence's exceptional painters. Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Raphael were among those competing with Leonardo for commissions. And Leonardo's ever-roving curiosity made it nearly impossible for him to concentrate on painting. He thrilled in the explosion of ideas and began scribbling in a notebook wherever he went.
Leonardo write down all ideas he have, all things he has just read or heard in the street, with friends, and sometimes it's quite difficult to know if it's his idea or just quotations that he's making.
Leonardo's notes run the gamut from simple sketches to notes on subjects ranging from light and shade to paleontology to submarine warfare. Yet for all the 20 volumes with hundreds of pages of notes, Leonardo left us surprisingly few clues about his personal life. But they are certainly rich with information about how his mind worked.
The notebooks are fragmentary, they're contradictory. There are all sorts of materials that are on vastly different subjects, sometimes even on the very same page. And they are the absolute antithesis of the sort of notes that you as a good student took in college. He simply was not inclined to be a systematic thinker.
One of the greatest mysteries of Leonardo da Vinci is his handwriting. Nearly every single note he ever wrote was backwards, written from right to left, so one would need a mirror to read it. This led many to think Leonardo had something to hide.
The fact of the matter is, if you're left-handed, which I am, the normal way you would try to write is from right to left. You don't push a pen, you pull a pen. And it's perfectly possible that he developed this because he didn't have a nasty first-grade teacher to keep him from doing otherwise.
Leonardo would follow people into taverns, brothels, and even the gallows, sketching their faces for a series of caricatures known as the grotesques.
It's very clear in Leonardo also that contrast is how you know things. In other words, to know the beautiful, you must know the ugly, and vice versa. What the grotesques are probably most basically about are looking at the variety of possibility in the biological world. There's actually one sheet where he compares a horse's head to a man's head, to a lion's head.
If the painter wishes to see beauties that would enrapture him, he is the master of their production. And if he wishes to see monstrous things which might terrify, or which would be buffoonish and laughable or truly pitiable, he is their Lord and God.
It's clear from Leonardo's notebooks that his ideal of beauty emphasizes the male body, which he spent hours and hours sketching. His sketches also betray poor knowledge of the female anatomy. And in all his notebooks, there are almost no indications of relationships with women. This has led scholars to conclude that Leonardo was probably homosexual.
It is likely that he had some kind of relationship with men, but in the context of an artist shop in the 15th century, that probably would not have been such a remarkable thing. Leonardo often spoke very disdainfully of the procreative act.
The act of coupling and the members engaged in it are so ugly that if it were not for the faces and adornments of the actors and the impulses sustained, the human race would die out.
Over 400 years later, Sigmund Freud ventured a famous analysis of Leonardo's sexuality based on a childhood memory found in the artist's notebooks. He claimed that it was unlikely that Leonardo had ever embraced a woman in passion. Early in 1476, when he was 24 years old, Leonardo faced the darkest moment in his life. He was brought before the Florence court of law and publicly charged with sodomy. The accusation had been made anonymously to Florence's so-called officers of the night, or morals police. The charges were apparently dropped for lack of proof, but for Leonardo, the public humiliation was excruciating. His 1480 painting of St. Jerome perhaps reflects that pain, the thin, anguished saint beating his breast with a stone in the desert. In addition to pouring emotional power into this painting, Leonardo showed how precisely he could paint the human anatomy. And he gave the painting a realistic visual perspective, something he chided his fellow painters for ignoring. One friend he criticized was Sandro Botticelli. Here in The Birth of Venus, Botticelli's figures float as if against a backdrop and lack the third dimension that Leonardo valued so much. Leonardo may have been way ahead of his fellow painters, but he was becoming less popular with the more influential patrons of Florence. The fact was that Botticelli was one of several painters who were virtually eclipsing Da Vinci. Leonardo was nearly 30 in 1481 when Lorenzo de' Medici got a request from the Vatican to send Florence's best painters to Rome to decorate the new Sistine Chapel. Botticelli was chosen, along with almost all of the other leading Florentine artists, but Leonardo was left out. This was undoubtedly a crushing humiliation. Leonardo was clearly a master, but he was considered unreliable. His interest could not be confined to the canvas, and more often than not, he failed to finish his assignments. In March of 1481, a small church outside of Florence engaged Leonardo to paint an altarpiece representing the Adoration of the Magi. He must have been badly in need of work to sign a contract so unfavorable to him. He had to pay for his own supplies, and if he failed to finish in 30 months, he would forfeit the painting and his pay. Given this ambitious composition, Leonardo must have known he could never finish in time, and he didn't. But he broke new ground with the work, and even his rivals, including Ghirlandaio, Botticelli, and Raphael, stood before this painting in wonder.
It's such a revolutionary art. You can see all the new art that Leonardo is inventing. Probably it was even too new for himself, and he left it unfinished, yet it's probably the first really modern painting of the time.
The triangular structure of the foreground group becomes an absolute principle of high Renaissance art. The emphasis on diversity, the old, the young, the bald, the bearded, the idea that he states later in his notebooks that you should paint a figure from the bones outward. If you look on the right side of the picture, there is an elderly man, and you would swear it's a skull.
Near the edge, Leonardo painted a young man, his head turned away from the infant Christ. It is said to be Leonardo portraying himself as very much the outsider. 1481 had been a miserable year for Leonardo. Wounded by his public trial, bitter at being passed over, he turned away from Florence to pursue a new life beyond its walls and challenges beyond the skills of a mere painter.
The life of Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci will continue in a moment, here on the Biography Channel.
Sometimes I feel like a mother's child.
They're the people you thought you knew, the lives you want to know more about. 24 hours a day. This is the place for the lives of our times. You're watching the Biography Channel. You are watching the Renaissance master, Leonardo da Vinci, part of Leaders and Legends, here on the Biography Channel.
In 1482, hoping to put his unhappy years in Florence behind him, Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Milan. He felt Milan offered opportunities Florence could never give him. But to make it here, he would have to find a way to present himself to the powerful Duke, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro.
Leonardo was in his 30s when he arrived to Milano. He left Florence because he was quite unhappy there, but also because he heard that Ludovico Il Moro wanted to build a very large statue to honor the memory of his father. Leonardo really wanted this commission because it was a very prestigious one, but strangely enough, he had never made yet anything really significant.
He wrote a daring letter to the powerful Duke, offering his services not as a painter, but as an engineer.
This is real chutzpah. The guy claims he can do all sorts of things. They have to do primarily with warfare, weapons, defenses, and he says, I can do all this stuff. And it's very interesting because in the middle of the letter, he slips into the future tense. In other words, he hasn't done them. In fact, he hasn't done any of them. So this is one of the great self-promotion deals. Then you get to the end. The very end, he says, P.S., figuratively speaking, I can do art for you too, and I can do the great horse in memory of your father.
Leonardo worked steadfastly to impress the Duke. He was 32 when in 1484 an outbreak of plague hit Milan and the city's streets became choked with the dead and the dying. Leonardo puzzled over how he might reduce the disease by spreading the population, which he said was herded together like a flock of goats, filling every corner with their stench and spreading pestilential death. Then he set down his ideas.
There's one where he shows really a two-level city, the Park Avenue people, as it were, up above and then down below, canal for sanitation, transportation of goods, and so forth.
Finally, Leonardo succeeded in impressing Ludovico Il Moro, and in 1489 the Duke took him on as court engineer. Now, Leonardo was in his element. His responsibilities included everything from designing an indoor plumbing system to dreaming up costumes for the court pageants. Leonardo even came up with a design for a revolving stage.
Milan was a very luxurious city, not the most literate city, but the richest, and probably the one where they have the most fun. Leonardo was very happy in Milan. Ludovico Il Moro let him do almost exactly what he wanted. It was a very comfortable position.
Although the Duke's castle was already a formidable fortress, Leonardo began to fill page after page with designs to bolster its fortifications. Indeed, the never-too-distant threat of war posed all sorts of problems which tested Leonardo's imagination. He designed a bridge that could be collapsed before the enemy approached, a primitive machine gun, and even a flamethrower. Water, too, fascinated Leonardo, and he began to muse about devices for navigation. He drew a flotation device, water skis, and an underwater diving mask. But as intrigued as he was with designing weapons of war, he was also concerned that his ideas might be misused.
I do not wish to divulge or publish this because of the evil nature of men who might use it for murder on the seabed.
Leonardo was reportedly a vegetarian, and he wrote that one should not let the body become a tomb for other animals, an inn of the dead. In fact, Leonardo had a reputation for being so compassionate that when he saw birds for sale in the market, he would pay the asking price, take them in his hand, and let them fly away, just to return them to their lost freedom. Still, Leonardo continued to frustrate his patrons with his strong-headedness. On April 25th, 1483, he was engaged to paint an altarpiece depicting the new religious dogma of Immaculate Conception. The contract called for an elaborate, ornate depiction and even specified the colors of paint. But Leonardo disliked the pomp of the church, and in any case was not one to carry out instruction. He signed the contract and then unleashed his imagination.
Nothing like that had been seen on Italian painting before. Here we have this strange painting, triangular configuration, Madonna and child, the child blessing the kneeling St. John, and this strange sphinx-like angel set before a stalactite, stalagmite world, moisture-drenched world of half-lights.
Still, painting was not foremost in Leonardo's mind. He was consumed with the commission he had dreamed of when he came to Milan, the enormous statue for the Sforza dynasty. As much as the artistic challenge, Leonardo relished the technological challenge.
He's fascinated with horses. He draws horses all over the place. And he first wanted a horse that was rising. He settles on a walking horse, which is, from the point of view of statics, what he could achieve.
Leonardo thought this would be the everlasting monument to his scientific and artistic mastery. He cast a clay model which dazzled the people of Milan. But just before the bronze was to be cast, the French army stormed the city, threatening the very foundation of the Sforza dynasty. Sforza's troops were hard-pressed to match the superior weaponry of the French army. In desperation, the Italians commandeered the bronze which had been intended for Leonardo's statue to make artillery. Leonardo's dreams were dashed. Sadly, he wrote, "About the horse I will say nothing, for I know what times these are."
And then, as the story has it, the French come into Milan and they use the clay model, which it was, for target practice. And that's the end of the horse.
The rule of the 300-year Sforza dynasty was ending. Disheartened and bitter, Leonardo now began to think about leaving Milan. At just 42, the sun had now set on the happiest days in his life. He would have to find a new patron. He wrote,
"When fortune comes, seize her firmly by the forelock, for I tell you, she is bold at the back."
The life of Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci will continue in a moment, here on the Biography Channel.
Because you won. Because the road is unpredictable. Because laughter is contagious. From cover to cover, Biography magazine reveals why every life has a story. Now you can subscribe to Biography magazine for almost 50% off the newsstand price. 12 issues for only $18. Call 1-800-863-3300 to order Biography magazine.
It's Freeze Frame on the Biography Channel. She won our hearts in Love in the Afternoon. It surprised us in The Spine Tingler, Wait Until Dark. Later, she devoted her time to charity and raising a family, and became Hollywood Gold with 2 Oscars. The lovely and graceful Audrey Hepburn. Another Freeze Frame on the Biography Channel.
I'm Rob Weller for the Biography Channel. Can you name the comedian who hammered, sawed, and sanded his way to the top? It's the former class clown who became TV's top tool man, Tim Allen. He's the laughster who, despite all his grunting and Bob Vila from Hell routines, is still considered the poster boy for the new American male.
Men are pigs, right, women?
What might really surprise you is that both on screen and off, he's come a long way. First, he lost his father in a tragic car accident. Then a run-in with the law cost him hard time behind bars. But in the end, he married his college sweetheart and rebuilt the American dream. Lucky for us, the irrepressible Tim Allen managed to keep his sense of humor through it all. Until next time, I'm Rob Weller for Postcards from Hollywood on the Biography Channel.
You are watching the Renaissance master, Leonardo da Vinci, part of Leaders and Legends, here on the Biography Channel.
In 1495, the 43-year-old Leonardo was hired to decorate the dining room in the small Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. The theme would be Christ's last meal with his disciples. It was for this modest wall decoration that Leonardo would create the most ingenious composition in the history of art. He worked slowly, passionately on the painting. At one point, the prior began to badger him. Leonardo retorted that the delay was because he couldn't find a model for Judas. He then asked the prior to pose for the one who betrayed Christ. The suggestion was enough to quiet the prior's complaints, and he left Leonardo to finish. When he did, the result was nothing short of revolutionary. No painting would be so immortal as this, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper.
Leonardo's genius is to say, how do I capture the significant moment when Christ says, verily, verily, I say unto you that one of you will betray me, and psychological hell breaks loose.
Betrayal was a sin referred to often in Leonardo's notebooks, perhaps reflections of his feelings about his trial for sodomy in Florence 20 years before. No wonder the story of Judas affected him so powerfully.
Leonardo tried to represent the figures in a very natural, human way, to represent in actions and in attitudes the inner movement of the mind.
Instead of lining up everybody in a row, which was basically the way it had been done for the previous 100 or so years, Leonardo subdivided the 13 figures into 5 groups. 4 groups of 3 for the apostles, and then Christ isolated as a separate group. And that was a very remarkable innovation, much more comprehensible.
Leonardo wanted to paint slowly, so he rejected the usual fresco technique of painting onto wet plaster and experimented. He mixed oils and tempera directly onto the wall. The experiment failed. Soon after the painting was finished, the paint began to flake away.
Leonardo is accused of having used poor technique in the execution of the Last Supper. That is probably not altogether fair. The damage came from underground humidity that entered into the walls, and almost nobody has control of that.
With the arrival of the 16th century, Leonardo's services as portrait painter were very much in demand with Italy's noble ladies. But the commissions held little interest for him. When one lady sent a messenger to find out why he had not finished her portrait, the messenger reported back that Leonardo seemed weary of the paintbrush. Only one painting, a religious commission, held Leonardo's interest. In 1501, he began a sketch of the Virgin sitting on the lap of her mother, St. Anne, and reaching down to the Christ child. With this painting, Leonardo won the unqualified admiration of the Florence art world, which had so ignored him in his earlier days. But once again, although he worked on it for 8 or 9 years, Leonardo did not finish the work. Once again, his mind was elsewhere. What was consuming Leonardo's interest more and more was the flight of birds. He spent hours observing them.
The bird is an instrument functioning according to mathematical laws, and man has the power to reproduce an instrument like this with all its movement.
I don't know if you've ever looked at a bird flying, but it's impossible to tell the way the wing moves, for example. He could see how the wing moves and also draw it at the same time.
Leonardo dreamed of creating a machine to imitate the flight of birds, and beginning in 1495, even strapped wings on assistants and had them attempt flight. But finding a way to power a flying machine was always a great problem.
He starts out thinking that maybe we can flap, right? And comes to realize that that is really not possible. He's studying birds, but more than that, he's studying bats. And he finally comes up with the whole notion of gliding.
Leonardo also drew a machine much like our modern helicopter. But it was an idea, not an invention, and if constructed, probably would not have left the ground. Still, the range of Leonardo's technical imagination is astounding. He drew all kinds of devices in use in some form today, from parachutes to bicycles, with details that prefigure the modern versions. This crude sketch made by an assistant shows the all-important bicycle chain. On this same page is a prankish phallic cartoon and the name Salai, an assistant who joined Leonardo's workshop in 1490 at the age of 10. The name Salai was Leonardo's nickname for him and means limb of Satan. Despite the boy's somewhat tender age, he apparently became one of Leonardo's lovers.
Salai was a beautiful young boy that Leonardo took in his studio when he was 10, 11. And Leonardo took him probably just because he was very handsome, but he could use for a model first. I mean, he was a very poor painter. He never learned a lot. So probably he posed for Leonardo, maybe more than that. We have no certainty.
Salai stayed in Leonardo's workshop. Indeed, he was one of the few chosen to travel with Leonardo for the rest of his life. Leonardo, now 50 years old, was becoming a bit restless. He began to cast about for a new patron. In 1502, the powerful Duke Cesar Borgia, sketched here by Leonardo, took him on as a military engineer. Borgia was a ruthless warrior who had set out to conquer all of central Italy, and he must have been intrigued by Leonardo's designs for all kinds of brutal war machines, including giant crossbows, a moving tank, and a primitive machine gun. One drawing is of a scythe or spinning wheel of blades.
The nature of these offensive weapons, let's call them, is rather fanciful. And one really wonders whether there were serious proposals.
Leonardo did design war machines. He did design fortifications. But that's what every engineer designed in the Renaissance.
In 1503, Leonardo returned to his old home, Florence. His reputation had been so enhanced by his years in Milan that Florence now received him with open arms. But famous as he was, there was another, younger artist who was at center stage here. And Michelangelo did not share the limelight gladly.
Michelangelo and Leonardo were rivals, but at the same time they appreciate each other's work. Leonardo did the sketch of Michelangelo's David, and Michelangelo at the same time did a drawing of Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari.
They were so different one from the other. Leonardo was a courtman, handsome, at ease in all situations. Michelangelo was a solitary man, quite bitter already.
One day, Leonardo was asked to explain a certain passage of Dante. He saw his rival across the square and said, "Here comes Michelangelo, he can explain it to you." But Michelangelo turned and snapped, "Explain it yourself, you who made a model of a horse you could never cast in bronze and which you gave up to your shame, and the stupid people of Milan trusted you." In October 1503, when Niccolò Machiavelli was a young and powerful official in the Florentine government, Leonardo was hired to decorate the city council chamber. This would be by far the biggest commission Leonardo ever had. The mural would commemorate Florence's victory in the Battle of Anghiari. The opposite wall was to be painted by Leonardo's chief rival, Michelangelo. Leonardo worked on the project for 3 long years and then, as he had done so often before, left it unfinished. It is unknown why Leonardo stopped his work. Perhaps Michelangelo's taunt about the unfinished horse hit home. Perhaps he felt he was too old for such a rivalry.
Florence was too small for both of them. It was one or the other. They couldn't work at the same time in the same place.
In 1506, perhaps recognizing that Florence was now Michelangelo's city, Leonardo prepared to leave it for a second time. But first, he received a commission from a wealthy Florentine merchant. The man wanted a portrait of his young wife, Mona Lisa.
The life of Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci will continue in a moment, here on the Biography Channel.
I'm Bill Curtis. On investigative
It is the show of record on real-life drama. The Emmy Award-winning series that takes you closer to the truth. Investigative Reports with Bill Curtis, 5 nights a week. Every night, a different story. Every story, a different drama. Every drama,
the closest you'll get to the truth.
Investigative Reports, following Biography. Weeknights at 9, 8 Central on A&E.
This is the place to explore the lives of our times. You're watching the Biography Channel.
Hello, I'm Peter Graves. Welcome to the Biography Channel. Tonight on Leaders and Legends, visionaries of paint and canvas, artists whose unique perspectives change the way we see the world. First, are their images more emblematic of modern art than the Cubist paintings of Pablo Picasso? As an artist, he was compelling and controversial. As a man, he could be both compassionate and cruel. And as an elemental creative force, he came to symbolize the churning changes that characterize the art of the 20th century. Then he was a Renaissance man in every sense of the phrase, a painter of profound genius, an engineer and inventor of almost clairvoyant perception. Leonardo da Vinci stands as one of history's most brilliant and versatile minds. And finally, contrary to his own oft-quoted remark, his fame has lasted far longer than 15 minutes. A complex man whose life was as offbeat and individual as his art, Andy Warhol. Masters old and new on Leaders and Legends on the Biography Channel. I'm Peter Graves, and that's what's on tonight.
You are watching the Renaissance master, Leonardo da Vinci, part of Leaders and Legends, here on the Biography Channel.
In 1505, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned by a rich Florentine to paint a portrait of his wife, the young Mona Lisa. This seemingly minor work would become the most celebrated painting in the history of art. But the story of the commission has been doubted. Perhaps because the painting itself is so mysterious, there has been a great deal of rather fanciful speculation about whether there was ever a commission at all. In any case, the painting and its subject's legendary smile provoked all kinds of theories about who she was.
It's been said that the Mona Lisa had jaundice, that she was a pregnant woman, that she was a man in drag. But the truth is that the Mona Lisa is a great painting.
Once again, Leonardo stunned the world with his skill. This work has defined painting for 500 years.
The Mona Lisa is the most famous painting ever made. It is the inherent spirituality of the human creature that Leonardo was able to engender into the picture, that raises the human figure to some kind of majesty.
In 1506, Leonardo met Francesco Melzi, a beautiful boy whom he took to instantly. Francesco soon became his pupil and his closest confidant. Leonardo took Melzi and his other favorite, Salai, in 1513 to Rome, perhaps hoping for some role in the decoration of the new St. Peter's Basilica. But Leonardo hardly got the reception he expected or deserved.
This is when Raphael was in his heyday. Michelangelo was there carving the great Moses and the slaves and so forth. And where's Leonardo? He's a house guest in the Belvedere, which is an outbuilding of the Vatican. And he's doing all sorts of arcane experiments.
Leonardo, as a personality, became an anachronism in Italy at the end of his life. The flowering of the Renaissance in painting, it was not sympathetic to Leonardo's point of view, and I think that he felt very much out of things.
But Leonardo's influence could be seen in the work of the celebrated Raphael. Raphael pays homage to Leonardo by using his likeness to portray Plato in the painting The School of Athens. And even Michelangelo himself may have secretly plagiarized the older master's technique in the Sistine Chapel.
Seen from near, the Michelangelo frescoes in the Sistine ceiling reveal a technique of etching very similar to Leonardo's drawings.
Leonardo had long been more interested in science than in painting. He became fascinated with the mechanics of the human body and took corpses into his workshop to dissect. Never a religious man, he felt no compunctions about plunging his scalpel into the dead flesh so he could systematically detail every part of the body. When he came upon a 100-year-old man in a hospital, he sat down and patiently waited for the man to die so he could dissect him to see what caused such a peaceful death. That record is history's first description of arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries.
You might be deterred by the fear of living in the night hours in the company of those corpses, quartered and flayed, and horrible to see.
Leonardo's interest was purely scientific, but to others it seemed ghoulish. And besides, getting corpses was always a problem. When church officials learned of his dissections, they thought he had gone too far, and for the second time in his life, Leonardo suffered an embarrassing public accusation. This time the charge was necromancy, or worshiping the dead, and in 1514 Vatican officials halted his studies. Leonardo became morose and began a series of depictions, both visual and literary, on his vision of the end of the world, which he thought would be brought about by storms and floods. Perhaps these were the floods that had haunted him since he was a child.
Amid much weeping and wailing were men and women and children, all terror-stricken by the fury of the winds, which with tempestuous gusts were churning the waters under and over and all around, with the corpses which had met their death by drowning.
Now well over 60, Leonardo was tired. He had just endured the most frustrating period in his life. So when in 1516 the King of France invited him to join his court in the Loire Valley, Leonardo seized the opportunity. He probably knew he would never see Italy again. The king delighted in having such a brilliant mind in his midst.
Very often the king will knock at the door at any time of day or night to ask him something. And Leonardo was very pleased because, in fact, this was the dream of his life. But what's sad is that at this time, Leonardo was too old to do really anything.
After he arrived in France around 1518, Leonardo is reported to have suffered a stroke. He spent his next days concentrating on intricate geometric puzzles. In April 1519, a few days after his 67th birthday, Leonardo summoned a notary to write his will. In it, he dispensed his worldly goods among his assistants, with the bulk going to his most trusted assistant, Melzi. And although he had never been terribly religious, he suddenly requested instruction in Catholicism. After shedding a storm of tears, he confessed his sins. Legend has it that King Francis I was more than just an admirer, and that Leonardo died in his loving arms. That tale has been disputed, but it is clear that Leonardo died in the warm embrace of the French people.
As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so life well used brings happy death.
$28 million. It's away from the room now and on the telephone at $28 million.
Nearly 500 years after Leonardo's death, one of his 20 surviving notebooks brings $30 million at auction, an astonishingly high price, 2.5 times more than any manuscript to date. What is it about Leonardo that fascinates us so? From his backwards writing to the dissections by candlelight to his strangely captivating paintings, he seems to be some sort of Renaissance black magician. Yet the more we know, the more we can see he was not some futuristic sorcerer, rather a very gifted man living in extraordinary times.
Leonardo was a man of his own time. He was the most remarkable man of his own time. And the fact that he was an expert on perspective or on anatomy or botany or biology. These are all studies that other people were doing too. He was so remarkable that he did all of them. That was unusual. And that he did things very, very well.
He's very, very complex and very unlike a modern thinker.
Leonardo's advancements in the portrayal of perspective and emotion in painting were revolutionary, but to a large degree he was embellishing what had already been done by others. He also is considered an inventor of many modern machines, from the submarine to the helicopter, but those ideas date back as far as ancient Greece. Leonardo was not a painter or a sculptor or an inventor or a scientist. He was all of these, and each skill served all the others. He was, in other words, the original Renaissance man.
A&E Television Networks introduces 2 new choices of quality television. The Biography Channel, the life stories you love with a fascinating look at captivating people 24 hours a day from the original source, Biography. And History Channel International, provocative insights and global perspectives to understand our shrinking world. The Biography Channel and History Channel International. New channels, new choices.
I'm Biography Bruce in Atkins, Texas, talking to people about the people they thought they knew. How many Texans does it take to screw in a light bulb? LBJ was born in which state?
Texas.
What was the name of the famous talking horse on television?
Mr. Ed. That's Mr. Ed.
Who starred in the movie Urban Cowboy?
John Travolta.
And?
Deborah Winger.
This is the channel.
He was delivered upon an unsuspecting public. In almost 500 years, there had never been a non-Italian pope until the election of a Polish cardinal they called John Paul II. Now, from A&E's award-winning biography series, A&E Home Video proudly presents Pope John Paul II, Statesman of Faith. From his sheltered boyhood outside Krakow to his dealings with some of this century's most renowned world leaders, Karl Wojtyła's life story is one of sacrifice, achievement, and enlightenment.
Nobody really ever dreamed that such a sacrilegious act would ever be performed as somebody would raise a gun and try to shoot him.
Biography revisits the moments we remember and reveals a more intimate look at the private man.
He's an introvert, and you have to treat him so that he becomes tame and feels safe with you.
Meet the teacher, philosopher, diplomat, leader, statesman of faith, now available from A&E Home Video.
They're the people you thought you knew.